uh, there we go. That's what I was going to say. Thank you, Anna. And now we are official. Paul, as sometimes happens, uh, I actually don't remember the moment at which I intersected with you. I do remember a Guardian article about the wake, and I remember being very intrigued by the idea. I remember buying the wake and then not touching it because I opened it and I was like, "What is this?" Later on, I ended up reading it, loving it, but initially, without coming into contact with you, I didn't know what to make of it. And then somehow, I don't remember how, I found out about your course, Rewilding Your Words. And in the course of reading about it and finding out more about you and watching a, um, a documentary on your environmental work, but this was already after you had uh, gone sour on on the whole sort of corporate environmental movement. And I remember thinking, this man would be a perfect Orthodox Christian before I knew anything about your journey. And then soon after that, things started to filter through, and you started to talk about your conversion. And I thought, I need to know this man. So I went and signed up for your course, and then that was the beginning of a wonderful collaboration. Um, and that course, we're going to talk about it later in more detail, but I just want everybody to know it's one of the most um, life-changing things in terms of actual teaching that I had ever gone through. But I don't want to start there. Well, I want to start somewhere else. So um, you just finished a long and quite arduous series talking about the machine on your wonderful Substack, The Abbey of Misrule. And in the course of it, you gathered a lot of people. You were talking about some very incendiary things. There was, I'm sure a lot of spiritual, emotional effort went into the making of this long thing that will eventually be made into a book, hopefully soon. And then you came to an end of it, and quite bravely, you took a bit of a break, and then you started something completely new at the risk of losing the majority of your audience, right? But that middle section between going from the incendiary writing to the brand new Orthodox thing that you're doing, you took a Sabbath. I want you to tell us why, because for myself, I'm here in Belarus in the middle of nowhere. I find myself very much needing a creative Sabbath. So, what was it about the process of writing for 2 years that required you to take this short break? And what did you do in order to refill the creative well?
Well, you probably know the answer to why do writers need to take a break.
Yes.
It's kind of why does anyone need to take a break from anything that they're doing intensively? But I think maybe especially kind of intellectually and emotionally, what I did with that machine series, I started it off not quite knowing exactly where it was going to go. I did have a plan and I did have things I wanted to say. I wasn't planning to write a book as such, but it turned into something that looked like one that's probably a habit I have. And I was just really trying to, I don't know, I was trying to say, I thought maybe if I put everything I really think and feel about the world down on the page, I'll never have to say it again, which was probably naive of me, but there we are. I was trying to sum up a lot of the stuff I'd thought about and written about for the last 20 years or so. So that's what I did. And it was, it probably got bigger than I intended it to get. I had to stop it at some point because it could have gone on forever. So I did. And then, yeah, it's just exhausting. You know what it's like. You spent 2 years. Really, I did a huge amount of reading for that. It was like doing a PhD or something. And I've never done
Mm-hmm.
one of them, but it felt it felt like that. Make up your own PhD, huge amount of reading, a lot of thinking, a lot of talking to people as well, because I was debating with readers and things. And then what happened with that was it got a lot more popular than I thought it would. Um, it really did. Lots of people read it, and then people wanted me to come on their podcasts and all that stuff. So I did a bit of that, and that was interesting. But that's also, you're just using your brain all day,
Yeah.
and that's just tiring. It's as tiring as using your body all day. And if you do it repetitively for 2 years, you need to stop. And I think it's, I'm a big fan of Charles Bukowski, which I haven't really mentioned in my writing, but Charles Bukowski had this great philosophy of writing where he said writers just at some point they just need to stop. And
Mm-hmm.
he said in his case, really stop, go to bed for 2 weeks and pull the blinds down and just eat crisps in bed, and do that. And just don't talk to anybody until you feel better. And then when you pull up the blinds, the world looks incredible because you haven't seen it and you've just been eating crisps, which is a very Bukowski way to behave. But I think
Mm-hmm.
all writers need to do a bit of that. You can't just be on transmit all the time. You've got to take things in. And we are in the age of the talking head where people expect you to just blabber all the time. And if you're
Yeah.
not taking the world in, you haven't got anything to say about it, and you just have to stop. So I got to the fortunate point where I'd been able to make a bit of a living off writing this stuff. So I had enough savings to stop writing for a month or two. Um, I mean, it would be nice to have just stayed in bed and eat crisps, but I've got children and a dog and some land and all the other things. So I had lots of stuff to do. But at the same time, I spent a couple of weeks just watching the cricket. Actually, that was good. Very English. Very English. I watched the Ashes, so that was good. I watched the Ashes and I went fishing a bit and I can't really sit still for very long, so I didn't do that for 2 months. But it's just important. I mean, it's important for anyone, even if you can't take a month off, to just have time off, and that means time off reading as well as time off writing, which is quite hard for a
Yeah.
writer because we tend to interact that way. But I think if you don't do it, you're just in danger of burnout.
Yeah, definitely. So there was a lot of physical movement and downtime and things. Did you? So there was a concept that I heard from a man named James K. A. Smith, who's the editor of Image magazine. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's got a few interesting books that he's written. And he, on a recent podcast, mentioned something that he called an imagination fast, where those of us, because we're so overloaded with, he was talking mostly about people who are overloaded with visual stimuli. And so his recommendation was go and do something that's not visually oriented. Go listen to some music, go take a walk in the park and things like that. For you, it's less, in the situation, it sounds like it was less of a visual uh, fast and more of a reading fast. So was there any other sort of creative well filling that would fit sort of not in the resting or in the creative play buckets of things, but kind of were you doing anything outside of reading in order to fill your imagination for the next step?
Um, yeah, I mean, just being outside and working on the land and going for walks. You know, I spent a lot of time last year wandering around holy wells, which is something I'm writing
Yeah.
about at the moment. I did a little pilgrimage for myself because I was 50. I decided to visit 50 holy wells around Ireland just for personal pleasure and interest because I that's my idea of fun. So I did that and
Yeah.
I'm writing about that. But I also, you know, I've got a couple of acres of land here, so I could do a lot of work on that. You just need to get out of your head and into your body when you're a writer. I mean, I certainly do, because otherwise you
Yeah.
can just very easily spend your entire time, as you say, in your imagination or in your intellect or in your schemes for the world or in your kind of arguments. And these are kind of okay, but if you mistake them for reality as opposed to a map of reality, then you go bonkers. So, and you have to just go, I mean, on the subject of this course, you have to go and get in contact with nature. You know, you just have to walk and do some work on the land and whatever you can do. You can have a small garden and walk in the park. You still have to do that. You have to get out of your head and you have to get away from the cities and away from the kind of the human constructs, I think, and just sit with creation for a bit and get wet and get warm and do the things that happen. It's just you know, remember you're a kind of physical being in the world. You can forget that when you're a writer. You can very easily forget that you're actually a body. I can anyway.
No, definitely. So that being the case, and it sounds like you are someone, as you mentioned, just somebody who needs to constantly be moving around a lot. And your early interests were in the environmental movement. How did that lead to your becoming a writer, or did it? Or maybe the question just is, what is your journey? How did writing happen to you? Or how did you happen to writing?
Yeah, no, I don't think there's a connection between being an environmental activist and being a writer as such. I suppose I don't know why I wanted to be a writer other than that I just like books. That's probably why most people end up being writers. You know, I did a lot of reading when I was young and I loved books. And then at some point you just think, well, I wonder if I could write one. And then you start doing that. Usually when you're a child and you write fantasy stories or whatever else it is you write, sci-fi or terrible teenage poetry, all of that stuff. You have to do that and then you just keep going, really. I think it's as simple as that. The great thing about writing is how democratic it is. You just need a pen and a bit of paper. You don't need any qualifications. You don't need any technology. You don't need anyone to give you permission. You can be from anywhere. You just have to read a lot and want to tell a story and then start telling the story and just keep going until you're good at it. It's as simple as that, really. So I suppose I just did that. And because I always loved nature. And then when I went to university, that became politicized. I became a green activist in my 20s. And so I just thought, well, I'm going to write about that. Because when you're a writer, you write about what you're doing. You know, whether you're doing fiction or non-fiction, your life's always bleeding into it. And so my writing became a kind of a political tool for a while, I suppose. But I was writing before that. Your writing is always an expression of your relationship with the world in some way. And so, if you're an activist, that's what you tend to write about. Um, yeah, so that was that really. But I'm not an activist anymore, but the themes I was writing about, I'm still writing about, I suppose, in different ways. I think my theory about this is that every writer has a story that they tell, and they just
Mhm.
repeatedly tell the same story over and over and over again, and it's impossible to escape from it, even if you try and would like to. And you tell it in different forms and different ways and at different times. That seems to be what happens to me anyway. And I think it's true of a lot of other writers. So I suppose I've just been telling the same story in different forms um, for a long time. And one day I have this fantasy that one day I'll wake up and God will give me permission to stop doing it. And it'll be great. So you can relax now. You can go and do something else, go fishing, whatever it is. You don't have to repeatedly find another way to tell the same story. I think there's a kind of anxiety. It's quite interesting. You write something down and you do your very best to communicate what you want to say in whatever form. And then certainly for me, I get to the end and I think, oh, I haven't quite got it. I didn't quite do it. It wasn't quite there. I haven't managed to paint the picture that I can see in my head at all. So I'm going to have to do it again and and try harder. And I think that's what I've been doing for 30 years, I suppose. Um, and it's a bit of a curse, but it's also, it's the thing that you came to do, I think. If you're a writer, that's, if you're driven to tell these stories, you just have to tell them. You don't have a choice in the matter.
It's really interesting that you talk about writing as being democratic, and I think so many people think of it as an elite um, pastime. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, I think in a society where we can all read and write, it's extremely democratic. I mean,
mm,
it's also the case that there is a literary elite. There's a bunch of gatekeepers
yeah,
with certain background who want certain stories told. That's absolutely true. But the actual act of writing is extremely democratic. And today, much as I'm a critic of technology, it's also very easy to get your work out there. You don't need the
yeah,
permission of the people you previously needed the permission of. You just need a
yeah,
Substack or a blog you can print your own book online in 5 minutes. You can do this stuff. There's a lot of ways to do it. So in that sense, it's extremely democratic. As much as anything, it's a matter of confidence. I think a lot of writers I come across have a sense that you have to be a certain type of person to be a writer, and you don't actually. Those kind of people are actually usually the most boring ones, and we don't need to hear from them anymore. We want some people who don't come from the sort of background that writers come from, whatever that might be. So
yeah,
yeah, I mean, it has a there's an idea that writing is elitist, and I think that's because a lot of publishing is and a lot
yeah.
of reviewing is, but the actual, as I say, the act couldn't be more democratic. Buy yourself a $1 notebook and a pen, and you're away.
Yeah, it's really interesting that that's really true, and the foundations of that whole elitist system are crumbling in front of us. But of course, you were published by that elite gatekeeping system,
Mm.
in spite of the fact that the wake is something that is so different from what they normally would pick up. So the two-part question: one, what was it that pushed you from nonfiction into fiction, and particularly fiction of that nature? Which is so different in form in its form, not perhaps in the story, as you mentioned, it is the same story that you were telling before, but in form, it's such a unique form. What pushed you into that direction? And personally, I'm interested. How did you ever manage to get the publishers interested enough to publish something that is so different from the regular thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've got a strange publishing history because you're right. I've been published by quite big, well-known publishing houses, but at the same time, I've been published by tiny ones, and I've self-published some of my stuff as well. So what
Mm-hmm.
seems to happen with me is that I publish something, and then a publisher brings it out, and then they don't want the next book, so then I have to find another one. And then that's pretty much. I mean, I was with Faber for a few books, and hopefully I'll publish with Faber again, maybe, but they're not interested in this machine book that I'm bringing out now, so
Mm-hmm.
I've had to find someone else for that. Um, yeah, so I'm not somebody who has some relationship with a publisher that I just keep going back to. It seems to be very checkered, actually. Um, so I probably got almost as many publishers as I have books. And when I
Call it
publish,
guerrilla publishing
yeah,
in the
well, I
style of
call
the
it
wake.
either that or just chaotic publishing. I don't know. So I've been published by big corporate publishers and tiny little independents like Unbound and the Dark Mountain Project was all self-published stuff. So I mean the way that works is I don't ever think about the publisher. I just write the book and then we see what happens. And I would advise everybody to do that actually. Because someone's going to pick it up, and if they don't, you can do it yourself. So don't worry about it. I mean, the Wake, interestingly, the Wake's a good example of this. I started writing this book. I got very interested. I'm a history nerd. I studied history at university. I love history, and I'm particularly interested in Anglo-Saxon history, being English. And I just love that period. I just find it entrancing. And I came across the story of the resistance, the English resistance against the Norman conquest, which wasn't anything I'd ever learned in school. And it's a fascinating story. You don't really hear much about it. Decades actually of underground English resistance to Norman colonization. And I thought, well, that would make a great novel. And I experimented with all sorts of different forms with that, actually. I started off doing something quite postmodern where I had 5 or 6 different voices from different time periods
Mhm.
talking different styles, and that didn't really work. It was a bit stupid and boring. I couldn't pull it off. But one of those voices I started writing in was the voice of this Anglo-Saxon farmer who was involved in the resistance. And I thought, well, there's a story that's interesting. I'll just do this as a first-person story. I'll keep it very simple, keep it quite raw. That was what it seemed to need. Um, but I couldn't anyway write the story of an Anglo-Saxon farmer in modern English because obviously he wouldn't have spoken it and it just wasn't working. It seemed too fake. I have a problem with historical novels in that sense. It's very difficult to write a historical novel, because you're either doing sort of ye olde language, which just sounds fake, or you're
Yeah.
doing contemporary language, which sounds fake as well. So the solution I hit on there, just for my own pleasure, was I thought, I wonder if I can write a version of Old English and make it sound a bit like Old English, even though it's not. Because I don't speak Old English, and not enough of it to write a book in it, and neither does anyone else because it's not 1066. So I couldn't write it in Old English, but at the same time, I thought, well, what I tried to do was write a book in which all the vocabulary was Anglo-Saxon. And I didn't manage that, but I think I got about 90% of the way there. And then I thought, I'll take Old English and I'll try and make a contemporary version of it so that people get the impression of what it would have felt like to hear it, but they can still understand it. And after I got about a third of the way through, I was really enjoying myself. But I thought, no
Mhm.
one's ever going to publish this. This is insane. Um, but then I thought, as I say, as I think you should think, I thought, well, I don't care. I'm just going to write the book. This is my book. I want to tell this story. I'm enjoying telling this story. If it doesn't get published, so what? We'll just see what happens. It's always a danger
Yeah.
to start second guessing what might happen when you get a book out, to start thinking, oh, well, there's not a market for this, or this publisher won't like it, or such and such a thing isn't, I'm not supposed to say this, or any of whatever little uh, landmines you could step on because you immediately become extremely cautious. And I've got a little quote right up above my desk here, which I'll read now. It's from George Orwell, and I stuck it up above my desk about 10 years ago about novel writing. He says, good novels are not written by orthodoxy sniffers, nor by people who are conscience-stricken about their own unorthodoxy. Good novels are written, good novels are written by people who are not frightened.
Mm.
Okay, really good. Or
Yeah,
I
that's
think
awesome.
potentially good novels are written by people who are frightened, but they write them anyway. That's another way of thinking about it, right? So
Yep.
you just have to write the bloody thing. So I wrote it, and then yeah, predictably, nobody wanted to publish it. I did have one publisher who said, "I really like the story, but I think you need to rewrite the whole thing in modern English, and then it will be great, and
Mhm.
we'll publish it." So I just said no.
Yeah.
Um, so I thought, well, I'll self-publish it then. But then before I started to do that, I found this publisher, which at the time was very small. It's got a lot bigger now, called Unbound, which had just launched this really novel way of publishing novels, which was, as it were, which was uh, what do you call it? Crowdfunded novel.
Crowdfunded, yeah.
So we made a little film talking about the book, and you publish a little extract of the book, and you basically have to persuade people to punt up the price of the book up front before they publish it. So, give us 10 quid and you get a book when it's published. If you get 500 people doing that, you've covered the cost of publishing the book. So the publisher of Unbound, John Mitchinson, really liked the book because he's another Anglo-Saxon nerd. So he thought it was great. So we just did it, and it worked. Um, and then it got published, and then it got stuck on the long list for the Booker Prize, which certainly surprised me. Although
Yeah.
not the short list, tragically, but never mind, that's probably good for me. And it did really well, and actually it got weirdly got a huge amount of publicity precisely because it was weird. And it was the first crowd-funded book that made it to the Booker Prize long list. And the moral of this story is just write the bloody book, right? Because
Mhm.
you have no idea what's going to happen. If I'd written a book and thought, I wonder if I can write a book that gets put on the long list for the Booker Prize, it would have been awful and it wouldn't have worked. I just wrote the book and there we are. Um, so yeah, it's there's always with all of my books, there seems to be a long and winding road to getting published. It's never quite as simple as you think it's going to be, but that's again, that makes it interesting. And as you said, yeah, mainstream publishing is dying anyway. It's stuck and it's boring and it's cautious and it's unprofitable. So in a way, just ignore it, I think, and just write your story. And you can get it out there if you want to, I think. So and
Yeah,
I
we'll
think
talk.
yeah, my attitude is always I'd be very genuinely happy to self-publish any future books I write. So anything else is a bonus. So that's the way I see it now.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And there's something in there too that I want to bring out, and that's that you had a fairly clear premise, it seems like, for what the novel was going to be about. And this is a wonderful little, I think, bit of advice for authors, that you said you were going to write a story about the guerrilla movement, or the resistance to 1066, and yet that was the expectation that I had when I started to read the book. And the further we get
Hmm.
into it, the less Buckmaster is involved in any attempts to push away the Normans. And the further he goes into the fens, the further he goes into his own mind, the darker his own descent into madness goes, the further away we seem to be getting from any sort of historical um, account of that
Yes.
very interesting moment that you started with. But that's where the story needed to go. So I think there's something very profound about the freedom that you had to follow the story where you wanted to go, where Buckmaster wanted to tell it, in spite of the fact that really it was taking you away from the original premise in some sense.
Yeah, that's a good example of a book that got completely hijacked by its character. And it's really interesting when that happens because it was, as you say, it was supposed to be a book about almost not quite a political book exactly, but I just wanted to tell the story of this quite swashbuckling thing that was going on. And as you say, what happened is Buckmaster turned out to be a much darker character than I thought he was. And then the other thing that happened was this entire story about Anglo-Saxon paganism versus Christianity popped up, which was not at
Mm-hmm.
all what I intended to write. So, this character of Wayland, the smith, comes in, this great mythical smith who Buckmaster thinks he's talking to, or maybe is talking to, and really colonizes the book. And then you have this story about the old gods and how Buckmaster feels colonized by the Normans and the church, and can't get this through to anybody else. And as I say, that strand was not supposed to be there. It was really interesting, and that's what the book really became about. It's almost like a religious battle at the center of the book, and that wasn't the point. So it was very interesting that that happened. And I think, yeah, as you say, when that happens, you just have to let it happen, actually. I think certainly for me anyway, people have different ways of writing novels, but I'm sort of in between the two extremes of people who plot their novel very tightly and don't plot their novel at all. I always know where it's going, more or less. But you have to let the characters come to life. When a character comes to life and starts pushing you around, then I think it's a good sign because it means they've got an independent existence. So, but it did surprise me. So it was like almost every impulse was making the book more and more unpublishable by the second. So anyway, so that was what happened.
Well, and there was something about that freedom to let the character do what he wants to do, that it turns off some Christian readers and writers who approach me with this question. They say, "Well, what is this that you're doing? Are you giving free rein to some sort of spirit that's inside or outside you that you have no control over? Is it something that perhaps you shouldn't be giving free rein to?" But I try not to answer those questions, because you can talk about this for hours and not get to any really good solution on the problem. But what really struck me is that you seem to allow Buckmaster the intuition, or you allow yourself to write Buckmaster into a philosophical and theological corner that he couldn't get out of, and it was very much connected with the darkness of the old God. And so when he
Mm.
goes insane at the end, it's almost like he's, from a Christian perspective, possessed by a demon, or something like that. I don't think that's what happens to him, but it felt very much like a proto-Christian account from a man who was not yet Christian, but whose subconscious was talking to him that this is where you're going to go. Do you,
Mm.
when you look back at that story, do you see any inklings of what was to happen to you in a few years after that?
Not really, no. I mean, it's an interesting way of looking at it, though. I mean, there's something to that. I've written three novels, and they've all been religious books, actually, um, with no intention of them being religious books. If I'd sat down to write a religious book or a Christian novel or something, it probably would have been awful.
Mm-hmm.
But they turned out to be that. because that's the thing that's been obsessing me for a long time. And becoming an Orthodox Christian is kind of the end point of that very, very long search, as it is for a lot of people. Um, but yeah, so the question of I suppose this dark religious battle and where it ultimately takes you was going on in there somehow. I mean, you never know why you've created a character or why you've written a story or what's trying to communicate to you. I think the interesting thing about writing a novel is your readers will often tell you what you were doing, even though you didn't really know. And
Yeah.
I've had that a few times. I've had that a few times. I had a very interesting email a while back. I'd written my first two books. I wrote The Wake and I wrote Beast. And then I thought by then I was going to write a loose trilogy, which was a themed trilogy set over 2,000 years of time. So I wrote The Wake, I wrote Beast. And I had this email from a reader and he said, I love your books. He said, and the thing I love most about them is that you're the only author I know who understands the importance of birdsong. And I thought, what's he talking about? And he said, I've noticed that all of the important points in your novels are marked by the appearance or the sound of birds. And I thought, what is he on about? So I looked back in them, and he was right. Absolutely almost every crucial moment in these two books is marked by birds turning up. And I thought, where does that come from? That's very, very interesting. And what I actually did then, as a result of that man's email, I consciously made birds the heart of the third book. And I created a religion in the third book, Alexandria, which is focused around birds as messengers of the gods. I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I might as well do it consciously. But it's very interesting. You don't know what you're doing until somebody with a different perspective points it out to you. So there's all sorts of strands playing around. This is one of the reasons you have to allow some freedom in your book, because otherwise you're trying too hard to let your rational mind control what actually wants to happen. And what's going on under the surface is usually much more interesting than anything you can rationally plan.
And you're able to bring that out in other people, which is so interesting because with something so intuitive, with something so tied up with one's own native talent and one's own instinct and one's own subconscious, to be able to do it in your own work is one thing, but then to be able to draw it out of other people is something entirely different, especially when there doesn't seem to be much of a tradition from which you can take this sort of teaching where you can help other people shut off their brain and allow those external influences to come in that are perhaps already in there and then have some sort of a symphony that produces something that's very unexpected, which is exactly what you do in the course. But in rewilding your words, and in the form that I took it is the form that you gave when you were still not a Christian. And there, central to you was the idea that you want to allow setting and the natural world to speak through you, to as much as possible shut off the rational mind, and to allow the character of place to come in and speak through you, and perhaps speak a larger truth than you yourself might be able to create. That being the case, becoming Orthodox, has that shifted your perspective on how that might work and how you teach the course?
Well, I don't know really. It's early days for me to understand how becoming Orthodox has affected my writing. I mean, it has in my non-fiction writing, which I can write about wells and saints and things, and that's interesting. So that's consciously easy to do in a way.
Mhm.
But in terms of fiction, I don't know yet. I mean, what I've tried to do, what I was doing with this course that you came on, and what I'm doing on this course as well, is I'm, as you say, to some degree, trying to let nature speak, and just let people listen to it. Um, which is something some Christians get a bit antsy about. They think it's pagan, but it's not pagan. It's listening to creation, which is conscious and alive and real and can be communicated with, just as your dog can be communicated with. You know, we can speak and hear the rest of nature by connecting with it. And most human societies in different ways have done that, and ours doesn't do it because we've spent a few centuries pretending that matter is just dead and unconscious and we can do what we like with it, which is a profoundly unchristian attitude, if you ask me, profoundly unreligious attitude and inhuman attitude. So we can't do that. We have to take ourselves out of our bodies and go outside. And just the act of sitting in a wood and not saying anything and seeing what happens and tuning yourself into what happens around you. And there's exercises I use on the course that just help you to sort of break through what your rational mind wants to do and start paying attention. It's all very simple, really. I mean, nothing I'm doing is profoundly radical. It's really just finding techniques as a writer and as a human that allow you to shut your jabbering mind up for a minute and stop analyzing everything and trying to take from it and write it down and turn it into concepts and start listening to it. And the reason I know how to do that is because I have had to work out how to do that myself, because I spend most of my time with my lab jabbering mind trying to turn everything into a clever system. Um, and it's not too difficult to be quiet and listen to the creation speaking to you. And when you do that, things happen. And I think that's not so different from, I mean, I wrote a piece in The Guardian years ago when I was still writing for The Guardian, and about seeing a place as a character in your book, which is something else I tried to do in all my novels. And it's something I talk about on this course quite a lot. Um, the the environment that your human characters operated in, especially if it's a natural one, is not just a backdrop they walk through like a stage backdrop. It's alive on its own, and certainly in Beast, especially my second novel, but in all of them actually, I very deliberately made the land a character with that could affect the other characters, not always in a good way. It's nature is not always a benign thing here, but it's always alive and it's always reacting to you. Um, Things are always happening when I don't know, to look at it from an Orthodox perspective, if we look at the way that, if we look at a miracle, or if we look at the way that so many saints react with the natural world, or uh, this is all our ability to react to and interact with the matter of creation, because it comes back to us if we do that. Um, so it's fundamentally Orthodox, actually, in that sense. It's paying attention to the material reality of things. So we just have to shut ourselves up. We have to find techniques to shut ourselves up and allow ourselves to go outside and see what that does to our writing. And it will always broaden it and make it more interesting, because once you start listening, you're going to hear things you didn't expect to hear. And that's what makes it interesting. So how that will be affected by me becoming Orthodox, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot more ostensibly Orthodox and Christian and church fatherly material that I can bring into the course, which actually is really interesting. There's a lot of great stuff. But fundamentally, um, I think that the basic premise is the same. Creation will speak to you if you listen to it. And so you have to just do that. You have to work out how to do that, and then you see what happens.
And sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's even better to hear the voices of those who are not, who don't even identify themselves as Christian, talking from that place where
Hmm.
they're more connected to the natural world. I'm thinking in particular Robinson Jeffers, who had never read until I had encountered him, and reading a collection of his poetry uh, made me made me want to be a better Christian, much more than sometimes than some of the more theological things I read, just because he was so attuned to the natural world, and yet his response to it was so pessimistic in some
Hmm.
sense, because he was unable to get past the violence and the pain of the world of the wars.
Hmm.
So there's something very, I think, something very valuable in having those many uh, different perspectives in your course, even for a Christian audience,
Yeah,
because
I think so. I think it's important.
yeah,
You ought to be confident enough as a Christian to be able to listen to people who aren't Christians, and
yeah,
remember that they have something to teach you. God, I don't think God only loves Christians. There's a great deal of indigenous spirituality that can teach us important things. Um, and there's, as you say, writers like Jeffers and many others, um, who can just help us to see things we might not be looking at. And we have our own filter that we can filter things through. But there is a great deal to be learned from other people and other traditions if we're paying attention. Not uncritically, of course, but that's the interesting thing about what's happening today in the West, I think, is there's a huge religious emptiness. There's a huge spiritual hunger. A lot of it's connected to the natural world, partly because we're destroying it at a rapid rate, in a way that we've never destroyed it before. And we've created these vast megacities and these inhuman landscapes that are culturally ugly and environmentally destructive. And they're just eating us alive. And Christians have to be able to say something about that. And if they haven't got anything to say about it, people aren't going to listen to them. And that doesn't involve rewriting Christian theology and making it pagan or something. It just means you go back to what the church fathers were teaching, and you go back to the Gospels, and you look at how we're actually supposed to interact with nature, and you look at the teachings about humility and the lilies of the field and the birds of the sky, and it's actually all there. And there's hundreds of saints you can listen to, and there are one of the reasons I'm writing my series on the lives of the wild saints at the moment is exactly that. This is all there in the Christian tradition. We don't have to make anything up, but we have to go back and dig it up again, I think.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite exciting. There's quite a few people starting to think in that way now.
Yeah, I think so. It's an interesting moment because the people that seem to attract attention are those who are less critical in the old traditional sense and more open to the possibility of truth coming in from unexpected places. And it's a very
Hmm.
exciting, and by the way, that's also reflected, I'm sure you've noticed this, in the writings of the most recent Orthodox saints, people like St. Porphyrius or St. Paisios,
Hmm.
who are, hardcore monks, but their ascetic writings sometimes read like something from the Far East,
Hmm.
just in terms of their openness to the spirit of the Creator in creation, and their desire and their willingness to see Christ in every single human being and every
Hmm.
single created object around them, which is a really exciting thing. And I think there's something about that that's coming together and drawing people together. It's very exciting.
I think so.
But the problem with us is that we are all uh, cooked barbarians. So you uh, having to write about this and having to travel and having to talk about this and having to be in planes and trains and automobiles all the time. How do you keep your connection to the world? And amidst all this activity, let's be more specific. What sort of lifestyle choices do you think are most crucial for you and for any writer to preserve in order to be able to continue to have that channel open and to be able to write well?
That's a good question. Before I answer it, I'm gonna just read something that I was looking for in relation to what we just said,
Mm-hmm.
um, because it just came into my head. I don't know if you've come across. You probably know this. Elder Amphilochios of Patmos. Have you come across him?
Yes.
Yeah. So he's Callistos where Metropolitan Callistos writes about him. Um, and he was a deacon under him. And he says he was a deacon at the monastery of St. John the Theologian on Patmos. And our elder father Amphilochios, who I can never pronounce, who died in 1970, used to say to us, "Do you know that God gave us one more commandment which is not recorded in Scripture? It's the commandment, love the trees. Whoever does not, whoever does not love the trees, so he believed, does not love Christ. When you plant a tree, he told us, you plant hope, you plant peace, you plant love, and you will receive God's blessing." There you go.
Love
So
it.
there's the elder of an Orthodox monastery. So you don't have to take it from me. I love that. If you don't
That's
love trees,
wonderful.
you don't love Christ. So there.
Yeah.
More. Sorry, I distracted you from the question.
No, not at all. Do you want me to
Um,
ask it again, or do you remember?
no, I mean, I suppose it's just a question of being in the world, isn't it?
Yes.
It's the thing is that I become more aware of this all the time since becoming Orthodox. Obviously, the greatest thing you have to run away from is pride as a Christian. But if you get published, it's a great temptation to pride because people read you and then they tell you what they think about you. And even if they're attacking you, they're still talking about you. So it's you've got to be careful with it. Actually, it's quite difficult. Going up and talking to a bunch of people, it's difficult to stand on a stage in front of a bunch of people and not feel important in some way because they invited you to come and say something. So you must have something to say. And even the act of getting a book published or something, or even writing a Substack and having people comment on it, it's all kind of very, very easy to puff you up. And writers are probably a bit egotistical anyway, or we wouldn't be doing this, right? We want people to notice us and read us and tell us we're fantastic and give us prizes and all that. At some level, even if we pretend not, we must be. Otherwise, why would you write anything?
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think you have to be careful with that, I suppose. But I suppose it's part of the work, isn't it? It's good ascetic practice. How can you write? How can you put God at the center of your writing? How can you tell the stories you think are important and not have it be about you? That's the challenge. And actually, I think probably if you're writing the correct things, then it isn't about you, and you just have to remember that. Um, and other than that, you just have to make time, as I said, always to go outside and just remember you're just a tiny little person and you don't really matter very much, and you should go and sit in the forest as much as you can. Don't get high on your own supply. We've all seen people who imagine they're tremendously important cultural commentators. Thing about the moment is there's a huge incentive for everybody to talk all the time. right?
Yeah.
Because everyone will invite you on their podcasts, and you can make yourself into a person with an opinion about absolutely everything. And if you're witty and controversial enough, you can make a big career out of that and lots of money. And then that's just a disaster, I think, especially if you're trying to do anything real. Which is why another piece of advice I always give to writers is, do shake it up. Don't find yourself stuck in a rut. It's one reason I decided I was just going to write about something completely different on the Abbey of Misrule, and there we are. See what happens, and if people don't read it, that's okay. Do something else, but you have to be careful not to get into a situation where you are just saying, well, people like this, I'll just keep doing this, and I'm making a living from it, so this is good. You have to be careful not to get stuck. That's just an artistic point rather than a Christian one. You just have to keep
Yeah.
shaking it up for yourself, because if you don't, you'll just get stale and you'll be like a band churning out terrible albums for 20 years. Then just instead of stopping, which you should do. Yeah, I think it's really useful for writers actually to always say to themselves, maybe I should just stop this. And then maybe you will and maybe you won't, but don't feel that you have to go on having some writing career just for the sake of it. You should only write if you've really got a story to tell. And if you haven't got one to tell anymore, you should go and do something useful like being a car mechanic or planting trees. There's a lot of writers in the world, but there's not enough tree planters.
So one of the projects that you have coming up is making that, the series of essays on the machine into a book. And that's going to involve a lot of editing, probably, maybe some rewriting. How do you anticipate, and this is more of a practical question, perhaps, how do you anticipate going back into that headspace, which was very COVID related, very combative, and quite different from the space of exploring the lives of wild saints, who are about as far away from the machine as you can get. Are you
Hmm.
going to have to take a break between the two, or do you think you'll be able to do both at the same time?
Yeah, I have taken a break really. Because I had my period of having a couple of months off writing in the summer where I didn't write about anything, and when I came back, I started writing about something different. But yeah, now I have to go back into that space, and I'm sort of not looking forward to it actually.
Mhm.
I want to turn these things into a book because I think they were worth writing, and I think people found them useful, and I don't want stuff to just sit on the internet where it will disappear. I think if something that you do is worthwhile, you should put it on paper, because there's a chance that in 100 years it will still be sitting on some dusty shelf somewhere, whereas your blog will not be anywhere. So, if
Yeah,
there's something valuable, I really advise all writers to put it on paper, even if you self-publish it. So that's that really. I like books. I wanted to put it all together, put it behind me. But yeah, it's funny because I'm actually supposed to have started it about a month ago, and I keep finding reasons to put it off. And there's always other things.
okay.
I still haven't. I've got it all printed out, and I've got to just sit down with the bloody thing and go back down into that space. But you're right; it's a different headspace. That it's very much, yeah, it's just a very different place to be. So I'm going to have to just jump back into it and do the job. But once you're taking writing that you did on the internet, turning it into a book, you have to do something stylistically different with it.
Yeah,
Obviously, it doesn't read
yeah.
the same. So, but yeah, I'm just going to have to grit my teeth and stop making excuses. Actually, get on with it.
No, I'm excited. I'm really curious to see what you do with it, because one of the things that um, I read the whole thing without stopping, but I kept hoping that you would get to the end point more quickly. When you
Mm.
when
So
you got to the
what?
point, no, not to finish it. But what I mean is that you started to talk about the how of defeating the machine, where you really started to get into the meaty stuff of, how to be a cook barbarian, and how to be an Orthodox Christian, essentially, or a Christian, essentially, and how that's the best way to combat the machine. And in a book, of course, you're gonna have to it's gonna have to be more streamlined in some sense, right?
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot that needs to be cut out, but when you're writing online, you're repeating yourself all the time.
Yeah,
You have to keep reminding people what you said last time, and then
yeah,
linking to things and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of fat that you can cut out actually. But of course, the end bit about what to be done is always the hardest bit, right? It's very
yeah,
easy to critique the world. We can critique the world forever, and it kind of has to be done. It's useful to have a critique, but actually, what to do about the critique is the is the tricky thing, without becoming sort of unrealistic or monstrously arrogant or just sort of yeah, I don't know, weedy. I mean, you can't write a giant critique of the machine and then have a sort of anticlimax. Something's got to happen. You've got to work it out to live. But that's the hard bit, and it's the ongoing bit as well. So But
Yeah.
yes, I'm going to have to. There's going to have to be a lot of words cut out. But that's actually quite nice. I like the process of going through with a big red pen and slicing sentences out. It's quite satisfying actually. You spend
Cathartic.
ages writing them and then you cut them all out. But
Mhm. Paul, could you tell us a little bit more? We've mentioned it in passing and given some details, but could you tell us more about your course specifically for St. Basil's?
yeah, well, as you said, you did a course that I've been running privately for years, and I was teaching it live before COVID, but I haven't been doing it since then. I've been doing my essays instead. But that was a course called Rewild Your Words, which I started to run as a weekend course in a few different places. I've taught it in Britain, I've taught it in Ireland quite a lot, taught it in the United States once actually. And it was really a weekend course aiming at doing exactly what it says on the tin, if you like. As I said before, trying to get writers out of their very human-centered place and get them into a wilder place, to get them to just pay attention to the landscape around them, to get them to understand that nature is very much more conscious than we think it is, that it's watching you as well as you're watching it. That when you go into the woods, for example, with your notebook, the woods are paying attention to you in a very literal sense. Every creature in that wood is watching you. The trees can sense you. The mitochondria beneath the soil can sense you. Um, you're always part of something. We have this very modern, very rational, and again, I think not very Christian idea that we can be observers of reality. We can step outside it and we can observe it. And it's a sort of pseudo-scientific attitude that a lot of writers have. I'll go and I'll write my travel book or I'll write my nature journal. But you're always part of the thing you're writing about. We know that. And what I'm trying to do with this course is show people that, and that applies to the non-human world as much as it applies to the human world. So if you assume, and we can demonstrate that this is true, that nature is a lot more conscious than we think it is, and that this modern kind of Cartesian notion that the world is a machine and we just have to manipulate it correctly is wrong, and as I say, unchristian. Um, how would you write? You know, how differently will you write if you understand that the world is watching you as well as you are watching it, that nature is conscious, that there are ways to listen to it, that if you treat the landscape as a character, your book will look completely different, that if you just go and sit in the woods for a couple of hours and really pay attention to something small and tiny, it will look different. How does it feel when you try to write from the point of view of something non-human? That's one of the things I focus on quite a lot in the course. And that always produces really interesting results. Just sending people outside for 2 hours and saying, go out, find something that isn't human and write from its point of view and come back and see what it says. The results are always interesting and always incredibly diverse. And it always breaks open people's perspective. And that's what I'm really trying to do with the course. I'm just trying to break the perspective open, so that we go beyond, say, being a novelist and trying to create a human character to being able to create a non-human character as well, and also to understand that everything we do is within this matrix of the created world. You know, and if you think you're not reliant on nature, try holding your breath for 5 minutes. That's always, that's always the indication of what's going on. So, just as much as anything, sending people outside with some thoughts and some exercises. There's a lot of teaching I do, lots of quotes from other poets, from indigenous teachers, from Christians, from uh, I'm going to retool this course now that I've had 3 years of orthodoxy. There's going to be a lot more from the church fathers. There's going to be a lot more orthodox theology precisely about nature and Christian understanding of nature. And that's going to be a bit experimental and quite interesting. Um, so yeah, I just want us to understand that creation is alive. And if you write with the understanding that that's actually true and really believe it, then it'll change the way you write and challenge you and push you around, in the same way that some of my novels have pushed me around. And what the course is really, is apart from the actual teachings from other sources and from myself, is just a bunch of exercises where I send people outside for quite a few hours. And wherever you are in the world, I want you going outside with your notebook, even if it's raining all over you, and paying attention in certain ways to the world outside and seeing what you come back with as a writer and sharing it with the others. And even doing that on Zoom is a good thing to do, actually. In fact, it's much better in many ways to do it in an actual room with actual human beings, of course. But the interesting thing about doing it on Zoom is you find people who have completely different landscapes outside their windows. And so they come back with completely different experiences of them, which is interesting as well. So that's the idea. And hopefully by the end of it, you just see things a bit differently, and that will bleed into your writing. That's the idea.
This may be a dangerous question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Last
Be
year you
dangerous.
taught, yes, don't be afraid. Uh, Last year, in the first year of St. Basil's, you taught it for the first time to a primarily Christian audience. For you as a teacher of the course, because at that point it was the same course you had given before, to audiences that at that point were largely non-Christian. I mean, when I took it, it was an immense variety of people, of all interesting, different persuasions, shall we say. Did you find that teaching it to a room full of people that are largely agree on theological postulates, was it at all different, better, worse? What do you think? And
Well,
feel free to say what you want.
do we think that Christians all agree on theology, Nicholas? I'm not
Well,
sure.
no. Okay, fair enough.
The last
Fair enough.
2,000 years would have been much simpler if they did, wouldn't it? But yeah,
Very good.
no, no, I know what you mean. Yeah, I think in a way it was interesting to me to do it because I was quite a new Orthodox. I mean, I still am. I've only been baptized for 3 years, but um, every year deepens things, as you know, that's how it goes. So I didn't have enough experience or knowledge to be able to make it some kind of Orthodox writing course. That would have not, wasn't qualified to do that. I'm still not really qualified to do that, but I can give it more of an Orthodox inflection now. I think a Christian inflection than I could then. So I think, yeah, it was fine. I think it went quite well. But it was not it was not aimed at that audience, which wasn't a problem. But I think actually the more that we can tie this in with the way that the Orthodox spiritual tradition has thought all the time, the more interesting it gets. And it's a good challenge for me because it means I have to start looking into that, which I've done a fair bit of anyway. But I think that I do feel strongly, I feel intuitively that our relationship with creation is a vital part of being here. It's what we're supposed to be doing here. And I don't think that love thy neighbor just applies to people, just applies to humans, actually. Um, and I think that's an aspect of, as I say, it's an aspect of theology that's always been there. It's as much as anything, it's about how you live as a Christian. And so the big question now is how do you live as a Christian in the age of the machine? Just how can you be human in the age of the machine is the big question. And the subset of that for Christian humans is what are we supposed to do about living here
Yeah.
when we're ravaging everything else that lives so that we can have whatever we want to have. Um, and that's a question that I think Christianity can answer, actually. It doesn't need us to invent a new answer, but it does. There's ways that we can go back and look at it. So there's so many. I mean, you mentioned yourself a couple of recent elders, Elder Saint Porphyrios and Saint Paisios, and they're great examples, and there are other examples as well. By the time I finish my Wild Saints series, I'm going to have a good selection of stories to tell about various elders and saints who, right from the beginning, have lived in the wild and spoken to the birds and collaborated with the lions and all the other things that have happened all the way right from the beginning of the Christian story. Because the really interesting thing to me seems to be that what's being taught here is that as you walk towards theosis, as you become more godlike, as you empty your ego and destroy yourself and live for the world, the rest of nature recognizes it. It's like you slip back into the state you were in the Garden of Eden, and the other animals recognize it and they behave differently. And that's an amazing thought. It's a really, really interesting thought. And as I say, it's right at the heart of especially the Orthodox tradition, but the Christian tradition more broadly. So there's a lot of stories in there, and there's a lot of stories to be told about what happens if, again, just look at nature differently and start living differently with it. Maybe the hostility dries up to some degree, maybe the relationship changes. And we're desperately in need of changing our relationship with the rest of nature before we utterly wreck it and ourselves. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential to make it interesting. I think if I kept teaching this course, it'd probably get more interesting every year because I'd have discovered a ton of new things I ought to be saying or things I didn't understand last year. So I mean, the thing that is worth saying is I'm always obviously teaching it as somebody who's learning as I go along. I'm not some theologian who's going to give you a huge breadth of authority on it. I'm a writer who's stumbling around on the orthodox path, but since that's what we're all doing, that can be quite interesting.
No, and it really is, and it's yeah, it's really interesting. But I was looking um, at the results from the outside as the students were taking your class, I think that initially there may have been a little bit of resistance, as one might expect from a fully Christian crowd who's not yet ready to go and touch trees
Mm.
and sit with them and consider the tree's perspective. But as every single one of them had something break inside in the best possible way, and very interesting things came out. And I'm very glad that you agreed to teach it in the first place. So I have to ask, what was it that made you say yes when I approached you with this crazy idea of being one of the teachers for goodness knows what this thing is, this collection of courses for crazy people that want to write transformative stories for a new age.
Um, well, I just wanted to get rich, really, which obviously
Too
is going to
bad
happen.
that didn't happen.
Not, I have to say, I'm still waiting, Nick.
Yes,
And
you're gonna
so
wait a
there we are.
while. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, anyway, a bit disappointing, but yeah. Well, I thought it would be a really interesting challenge as a fairly new Orthodox Christian to try and teach this course to Orthodox Christians, just to see what would happen. See what would happen to them and see what I would learn from doing that. And I really like the idea of St. Basil's. And I'm not just saying that because I'm supposed to say it on this call. I think it's actually really important that the idea of an Orthodox writing academy is a really good one because it's very difficult, I think, to write as a Christian without just being a sort of Christian writer who just writes Christian propaganda, and even Christians get bored. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a common agreement that no Christian wants to watch Christian films, which because they're awful, but they shouldn't be apart from the Passion of the Christ, which is pretty good and pretty harrowing. They're mostly terrible. So why is that? Why is it difficult to tell those stories? I think it's the same reason that political people who write overly political novels write boring books because they just want to focus on the message and keep it straight and not offend anyone. And it doesn't work like that. You have to let some wildness in. I think, as I say, you have to be confident enough in your faith uh, and to be able to let some wildness in. So I just wondered how much wildness you can let into a Christian Orthodox teaching course, but also how Christian you can be when you're teaching nature as well. So those are two bits of tension, and I do think that it fits well. But I wanted to work out how I could make it fit well, I think. And for my own selfish reasons, I wanted to work out how to be able to talk about this as an Orthodox Christian and ask other people what they thought about that. And so it was an experiment, really. I thought it would be interesting. And so, as I say, I think this year it will be more Orthodox. There's a lot I can do with it. Quite looking forward to doing that. I think I'm a bit more confident as an Orthodox Christian now that I can not totally put my foot in it, hopefully, too much. Um, so yeah, I think it'll be interesting. It's a challenge, you have to. I think you get onto this path, you have to just keep pushing yourself, don't you? So,
Yeah.
and also I've been teaching that course for years, and it was getting boring. So I thought, right, I need to do something else with this. We need to break this open. And I think that if you get an invitation like that, it's probably come for a reason. So you should say yes to it.
Well, I'm glad you did. And just to be clear, I did receive this question already from at least one person. Paul and I are both Orthodox Christians, but the program is not limited to Orthodox Christian applicants. If you're not Orthodox, you can apply. And in fact, at least one of our uh, students in year one was not Orthodox. So it's we try to practice what we preach. So
Yeah, no,
please,
absolutely. Actually, the broader audience can make it interesting. I mean, obviously, it will have an Orthodox inflection.
yeah,
It's an Orthodox school, but yeah, it's often the case that the a few voices from beyond actually will keep it honest and interesting. And it's like we were saying before, bringing in those perspectives from outside the box, if you like, so you don't get too
yeah,
stuck. There's nothing wrong with that.
absolutely. I would like to open the floor to questions. If Paul, do you have a few more minutes for a free Q&A?
Yeah, do go ahead.
Okay. Please feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom manner or just start talking. Uh, we'd be very happy to hear your question. Go ahead, Helen.
Hey, thank you, Deacon Nicholas and Paul, most especially for coming on in your course Rewilding. Uh, do you do you know when you want to put that back out? Is it being retooled now? Would it go back online? I signed up for it a couple of years ago, but I was in a frozen writer's block place. I
Mm.
didn't take it, and I've guess I'm experiencing so much now that needs to be said, etc. But for others who have not taken it, will it come back online? Or can they go in you now and get it and take it at will?
You mean the one that's up on my own website?
Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah,
It,
that's as far as I know, that's still there. So anyone can go and do that anytime. And if you have done that course, the one I'm going to be teaching here is going to be a version of that course, just so you know. So if you've already done the course elsewhere, you're going to get similar things on this one. But as I say, you're also going to get more Orthodox and more Christian content. I'm going to redo the thing. But some of the exercises will be very similar. But if you want to go and do the previous sort of secular version, if you like, it's still up there via my website. So you could do that anytime you want to.
and do you write every day? Do you write something every
Do I
day?
write every day? Yeah, I do. I've always written every day. I mean, I don't sort of do journaling like some writers do. But I'm just so busy writing anyway that I have to. I'm always writing something. But I would strongly recommend that you write every day. It's a really good idea. What you need to do with writing is just get it. It's second nature to you. It's just the way that you communicate. So if you're not doing it, it's a really good idea to force yourself to do it, even if you're only doing it for 5 minutes a day. So you keep it going. Particularly if you're writing an ongoing thing, it's very difficult to take 5 days off and come back to it
Oh,
and get
yeah.
back into the space, you know. So yeah, I do write every day. I
Do you
can
write any longhand? Do you do
I
just
do. I don't write as much longhand as I'd like to, actually, but I do that, especially when I'm traveling. There are some forms you can't write in on screen. So poetry, for example, you can't write poetry on a computer, or I can't. You can type it up afterwards, but the
Mhm.
same thing with traveling, wandering around holy wells. You know, these things have to be written on paper with a pen or a pencil, I find. So yeah, but I wish I was doing more of that. Actually, these screens are a curse.
Richard, go ahead.
Hey all. Quick question for Paul, RE, the Holy Wells and such. And I know you just took a trip to the States. You were writing about Montana and so on. Um, so I grew up kind of in the woods, and I think that's a formative thing. I mean, I spent every single day in there for probably the first 15 years of my life for the most part. And so there's a bit of enchantment that I gained from that I since felt has been lost in adolescence and a bit of a prodigal decade or so. And so, kind of how I'm trying to frame the question is um, I know that it's not the best reaction that I bemoan that there aren't holy wells in the US. Um, and I wonder if I even had half the diligence to pray at the same spot, maybe one might just magically spring up. But I,
That's how it works. That's how they begin.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to think that might be the case. Um, so what I'm asking is, especially from a non-US perspective, what might you recommend off the cuff to say find enchanting places in the States? We don't have Stonehenge. There aren't many things. I don't particularly want to go to the Liberty Bell or whatever it's called, but Johnny Appleseed, the origin there. Does the frame of this make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I've actually had quite a few American readers saying the same thing. You know, it's hard. You're in a new country, so you've got a you've got a new tradition. There's a couple of things that interest me about it. I mean, obviously, I'm not American, so there's only so much I can say. But firstly, up in Alaska, you've got St. Herman and the Orthodox tradition that began up there, a long way from most people. But what you've got there is, as it seems to me, is an indigenous Orthodox American tradition starting off.
Yes.
And actually, that's quite
Yes.
exciting, you know. And you've got the same thing with Father Seraphim Rose, and you have St. John of Shanghai, and all these people who are genuinely American saints, actually, who have done work. And Herman of Alaska is particularly interesting to me because there are so many Orthodox Native American Alaskan people up there now, and that's really intriguing. But so you've got holy sites in a way where these people lived. You know, the grave of Seraphim Rose is very quickly becoming a kind of global shrine. But in terms of wells, I mean, holy wells have to start somewhere in a way. Water has to be hallowed and and blessed. And these sites begin. I mean, the ones that exist in Ireland are so old, nobody knows how they ever came to be. Some of them were probably pre-Christian before they were Christian. Some of them probably weren't.
I think
Um,
that's what I'm alluding to. I'm sorry, just to interject that is that
but
maybe
go
there are
ahead.
sites that have a bit of local legend that we
Yeah.
baptize, as it were,
Yeah.
or pour holy water onto, maybe.
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean that's how it starts. So I think you have to, the thing about America is that it's new and you haven't got all this stuff we've got. But that's actually in another way quite exciting. I mean, that's the blessing and the curse of America. You get to be pioneers and you get to make everything new. And that means you haven't got the layers of history that we've got, but also you're not held back by them. So, you have a chance to make these things start up. You have a chance to create a holy well, find a well, bless it, worship at it, do things there, create the tradition, take it across. I mean, that's what I would say. These things have to start somewhere. Um, there are always places in the landscape that seem holy, seems to me.
Hmm.
And so then the question is what you do with them.
Just a closing thing, open-ended. Do you particularly, or any of the viewers, have any spots they'd recommend in what's nominally the tri-state area, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York? So Paul, did you have anything that may have been on your bucket list in that area? And if anyone else wants to message, please do.
I'd
But
say
that's what
that's a
I'm
question. I would say that's a question for the Americans on the call. I don't think I could answer it, but if there are any, you can tell me what they are, and I can visit them when I come across.
right out. Cheers, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, Kevin, you're up.
Yes. So hello, Paul. I wanted to ask, you mentioned about locations a lot in this course and what you're focusing on, and which is something that is I know is very important for me. Like for the book I'm working on, I at one point I traveled back to the Southwest where I grew up, and I took lots of notes trying to just make sure I remembered how everything worked. And so I just wanted to know an example for you of like a moment in your fiction writing or any like where you had to like a location was the inspiration for a moment, or like looking back at how the nature worked.
In terms of the novels themselves.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Wake is interesting because the Wake was set in the fens of Eastern England. And the reason it was set there is that I wanted to make Buckmaster, the main character, a certain type of person. He had to be somebody who owned his own land because he's very prideful and very attached to his land. But a lot of Anglo-Saxon farmers didn't own their own land. They were sort of renting it or were obliged to their lord for it. And there's a particular type of farmer called a soakman who I discovered in my research. Buckmaster's always going on about how he's a soakman and how important that makes him. And a soakman has his land, holds his land freely himself. He's only obliged to the king, not to anyone else. So, and those soakmen lived in East Anglia, and it seems to be some sort of remnant of Viking invasion. So the soakmen are all hanging around there, possibly descended from Danes. And so I made Buckmaster a soakman, and then I had to set the book in the fens. And so I had to go to the fens, and I'd always liked the fens anyway. So I went to the fens. The fens are a very strange landscape even now in England, even after they've been tamed, but they used to be in the 10th century, 11th century, completely wild marshes that hardly anyone could access. The Normans found it so difficult to conquer them, because they couldn't get to the places where people were living because they kept falling in the marshes and drowning and being led astray by the locals. So I had to make Buckmaster a soakman, which meant I had to go to the fens. So I went to the fens and I camped out at night and I walked around in the fens and I got to know the place. And the kind of atmosphere of the fens completely defined the book. And if the Wake had not been set in the fens, it would have been a totally different book. And the fact that the gods live under the water, according to Buckmaster, the whole landscape of water and marshland out on the edge, even in those days, very wild, very distinctive, completely defined the book. So but I had to go there. I couldn't just read about that. I had to go to the fens. I had to camp out at night in the fens. I had to walk around the fens, make a lot of notes, take a lot of photographs, go to the old churches. I did a lot of research on the ground. Went to visit a lot of old Anglo-Saxon churches, looked at the architecture, went to the castle sites. All of the villages in the Wake are all based on real places. They're all versions of real places that still exist that I had to go to. So again, I had to get to know the landscape as a character before I write the book.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
Pico and Ruth, by the way, I also want to say, Pico and Ruth, both of you, I'm a huge fan of your work, so keep going. But go ahead and ask your question.
One of the things I noticed in looking at the publishing landscape is that when you look for Christian publishers, I mean, they're out there. They tend to be evangelical primarily, or kind of in that direction. When I looked at, I remember I was looking around for Orthodox fiction publishers, and I couldn't find that. I mean, there are a lot of religious writings being published. And so do you foresee a possibility that the Academy might, I don't know, maybe give rise to an Orthodox fiction poetry publishing outfit? Or, I mean, is that a thought?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I think there's probably a need for that because, yeah, anyway.
No, I'm glad you asked the question. Paul, if you don't mind, I'll take the stage for a second.
Yeah, do.
This has been an interest of our parent organization, St. Athanasius Online College, for a while now, and we're going to be announcing it officially in next month. So there is going to be an Orthodox. It's again run by Orthodox people, but not limited to Orthodox writers. Fiction imprint that is going to be working on a similar crowdfunding model to what Paul did, but one that is a little bit more author friendly. And I can't talk details yet, but I will say that keep your eyes open for the announcement. And I can even tell you the prospective name is going to be called Wood Between Worlds Press, which for those who recognize the reference is a Narnia reference. And yeah, we're very much thinking about continuing the tradition of the Inklings and exploring the storytelling, the things that people are starting to do now. People like Paul, people like Jonathan Pageau, people like Martin Shaw. So yeah, we're very excited.
Right. I just wanted to add to that Paul had earlier said that one can self-publish or publish through a publisher, and I've done it both ways myself as well. And one of the things I really appreciated from the publishing side is that there can be a lot of added value in terms of having really good editorial eyes look at your work. People who are motivated to make it better, and then good cover artwork and that kind of thing. So to the extent that you can, build that into whatever you're building, that would be great. I think people would really appreciate that.
It's a really interesting moment right now as traditional publishing seems to be collapsing. It's they themselves out of their own mouths are letting us know that they don't really know what they're doing. But the value of a publisher is it's still there. The fact that they can't provide it very often is not a function of the book selling industry. It's absolutely true that good publishers can provide great value. So what we're hoping to do is to maximize and kind of catch the best trends that are coming out of both the self-publishing boom and coming from the small indie publishing that is going to become the next big thing as soon as these big five publishers all die, which is what tends to happen every 56 years anyway. The big publishers now were, upstart indies about 50, 60, 70 years ago. They were doing things that were a little bit avant-garde, and they understood how to take advantage of certain openings in the market. So without getting too technical in publishing speak, that's certainly what we're hoping to do, is to give the freedom to the author of a lot of the things that self-publishing can do, including gathering your own audience and being able to have access to it, which is something that publishers don't let you do, but also providing for the kind of expertise that will allow for editing, proofreading, and especially cover design and interior design, because there is something about a book that is beautifully created and is something that when you hold in your hand, you appreciate the quality of the thing you hold. That publishers don't think about anymore, but people really like, readers really like. So that's what we're hoping to do.
Great to hear. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Good to see your face, by the way.
Yeah, you too.
Yes.
After reading you for years, it's
Ruth would have been here, but she's picking up my mother from some distant location, so she sends her hellos.
Say hello from me.
Wonderful. Helen asks, where do people like me find authors like all of you that need proofreading and editing? It is such a niche market, such as ortho writing. It's we're gathering it as we go. So check back in with us in a few years. We'll have a network. We'll hopefully. Please, any more questions? Yes, Andrew, go ahead.
Hey, really appreciate y'all both taking the time to do this talk. Really, really helpful. And I appreciate the question on the publishing side of things, because that's definitely been on my mind lately. I was wondering, for the participants in the class, I think there was something on one of the emails or something on the website that talked about kind of opportunities for ongoing participation and ongoing collaboration or something. I think there's a line about how you're trying to create this generation's Inklings or something, which made me smile. I love that. But anyways, I was just wondering if there were any other details on what y'all envision that looking like.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've just the past few months have been building out an online, a closed off online community. It's run on a platform called Circle, which builds these communities for large organizations and, well, large and small organizations. The point of it is that it allows for you to have a kind of social network, but that is not beholden to the big tech companies, and that is completely safe in the sense that it's set off from the rest of the internet. Nobody can accidentally wander in or find these things. So it's totally closed off. It's totally safe. The space we have now is called the Story Hearth, and we have about 20 authors there already. The St. Basil's component of that is the alumni from cohort 1, and they meet in a special room that's for them, but they also have access to the larger community. They get together to basically encourage each other to continue writing, to tell each other about the successes and failures. They have a writing time once a week where they all get together and write at the same time, which I don't understand, but it really helps them. So that's great. Like, I could never do that, but that's just me. I'm really glad it works for them. They also have access to ongoing education from St. Basil, primarily from me, especially on the business of writing and publishing. So the Story Hearth is hosting monthly business-related, publishing-related webinars that will eventually become a webinar library that will be the kind of go-to resource for new authors who are interested in self-publishing in particular. It's not self-publishing limited. It's open. Basically, the information there is useful for anybody, even if you have a publisher, because it teaches you what to do and how to get the attention of readers, which you need to do whether you're published by a major publisher or you're self-publishing. But eventually, it'll be a kind of resource that you can go and return to again and again to learn about every step of the way, from just writing your first draft to finding an editor to publishing and all that sort of thing. So it's also really nice because it's really a community. People are interacting with each other. There's a lot of people are writing a lot more because they feel like they're part of a team. Ultimately, what I hope this will become is a kind of community of writers that will all publish books that will become a kind of nexus for readers. So people will recognize people who are part of this community as the writers of this community, and will want to go there because they've come out of that place, which is the reference to the Inklings. The Inklings that were, everything that came out from the Inklings was recognizably from that same place, right? So what I'm hoping is that eventually all these authors will start publishing, and the more they publish, the more readers will come to them, and the tide will lift everybody's boat, because it's very difficult to be noticed right now on the internet. The internet is a huge firehose of information, and to be able to kind of stand out enough for people to pay attention for more than 5 seconds, that's a very difficult thing. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish, to become a kind of hiccup in the large stream of nonsense that people have to stop and say, okay, that's interesting, I want to go there. Does that make sense?
That's super helpful. I think the Inklings used to get together on Tuesday mornings at a pub and drink and smoke and argue and all that good stuff. So I was having some funny images of something like that. But no, it's really helpful. I appreciate it.
Zoom sessions where everybody sits and drinks and smokes. I don't know, maybe. Eventually we'll have to figure out how to transcend the.
Well, the pub is still there, of course. The pub is still there.
It is.
The Eagle and Baby.
Eagle and Child, yeah. So there's always a possibility for a future meetup there, obviously.
There you go.
A bit of traveling, but maybe.
It's also why
that sounds very nice.
it's also why the St. Basil's program starts with a live in-person retreat for all the students, because we felt that it's important for everybody to come together in the physical space and not just talk about writing, but also write in the same space and share ideas and come together in a way that you can't in this virtual setting, as wonderful as it is for us to be able to be here and talk to each other.
Yep, that's really cool. Well, again, thank you all so much. It's really really great.
Absolutely. By the way, Pico, please put your Substacks into the chat. I don't have them on the tips of my fingers to be able to type out, but I invite you to put them in because a few people were asking. So.
Yep, they're in. Yeah.
Okay, excellent, wonderful. Any more questions? And I'll put a link to the story hearth into the chat as well.
I already got it in there, Deacon Nicholas.
You already got it? Okay. All
Yep.
right. Thank you.
I saw that, and thank you.
Yeah. So right now, I need to say before we have any more questions and before we leave, the registration period for St. Basil's is open right now. We've already received a good number of applications. It is rolling admissions. So if you are interested in taking Paul's course in its new iteration, which will be in, I think, November, is that right, Paul?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to be the third of 5 or 6 classes that are going to be taught over the course of 9 months. And as I mentioned, they will start in an in-person retreat in August. And it's a really wonderful program. I'm very excited by the level of applicants. So if you would like to throw your hat to the ring, now is a wonderful time because I will soon be sitting down to read all of the samples. The only thing you have to do is to fill out a very short application form, pay the application fee, which is very, very small, and submit a 5,000 or so word sample, preferably your best work, so that I can see what kind of writers we have applying. And like I said, I've already read a few and they're quite good, so I'm very excited about the level. So the sooner the better because we might be filled up. It's a small group, maximum of 12. We feel very strongly that the small group experience is much better for bonding. So that's the link for that will also be in the chat, I believe. Yes, Anna?
Yes, it's there.
Okay, fantastic. There's a lot of stuff going on in the chat, which is great. Any final questions before we say good night? Oh, good night to me. It's 8 p.m. where I am, or 9 p.m. where I am. Go ahead, Richard.
Just a quick follow-up thing to the group. If I'm not mistaken, the St. Basil's is on Circle, right?
Yeah.
So would anyone mind if I just started a chat maybe for like local areas for tips on enchanting places or something of the like?
No, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. Probably follow up there rather than just trying to keep up with the chat and such.
Sounds great.
Cheers.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Paul, for taking the time. It's always a real pleasure to talk to you about this and about anything, really. Everybody, I hope you join us in the fall. It's going to be a wonderful class. Really is a transformative class. I can't recommend it enough. And thank you, Paul, again. And I will see you all hopefully at some point in the near future.